Hello, everyone, and welcome. Um, Welcome to the NeuroDevelopmental Movement Lecture Series. I'm Jessie Forston, and Betty Lamont will be talking today. I'm a certified neurodevelopmental movement consultant, and I trained with Betty and was certified in 2014. I'm also a licensed educator and a mom to two boys. In an email that you received earlier this week, you should have received an article titled, What is Neurodevelopmental Movement? And also a developmental sequence chart. You can use the chart today. We'll be referencing it. You can use it to take notes. And if you could just give me a little yes in the chat box to let me know that that came through and that you received that information, that'd be awesome. So today we'll be discussing normal neurological development. We'll be talking about how the brain can be stimulated to reach greater neurological functioning. We'll also briefly discuss how one might present when natural normal integration is interrupted or compromised. On September 22nd and on the 29th, we'll be going deeper into the ever-growing concerns of trauma and anxiety, and also academic attention, school learning, and behavior issues. So if you have an interest in those, you can sign up for those. They'll be taking place over the next 2 weeks. And during Betty's talk, I will be collecting questions in the chat area. So feel free to write any questions, and we'll get to them at the end with a quick Q&A. Please also include if you have to leave at the top of the hour, because we'll be sure to get to yours first. Also, we'll be staying a little bit past the top of the hour to make sure we can get to all the questions. And at the end of our time together, Betty will be offering 5 free 30-minute online screenings. These are screenings to give you additional understanding into how this work relates to you or your child. And we'll be randomly choosing 5 of the interested attendees, and Betty will contact you via email within the next week. In addition, this is being recorded, so we will be sending it out to you within 24 to 72 hours for a replay. And now may I introduce my friend, Betty Lamont.
Hello. So glad to see you all. I hope my face is showing up on your screen there. Jessie, it is. Okay, good. So I'm Betty Lamont. I've been doing what I do for about 33 years. I have a background in movement education, in public school education, in counseling. And I've worked through the United States and the UK and seen north of about 4,000 children and adults over the course of this time. My job today is to get you excited, deeply excited about the brain's ability to change over the course of the whole lifespan. At any time in the lifespan, we can make changes in the brain, and to give you hope. The way I want to do that is to go over the developmental sequence and how that sequence, which we will explain to you, prompts and stimulates the brain. And the developmental sequence is that sort of implanted programming that we have from birth. All of those little activities that many of us just overlook in childhood are critical to brain development. And if we understand that, we can go a long way towards addressing the issues of hurt brains in people who are older than infants, because this process is available across the lifespan. I believe that using the brain's own strengths to recover its functions is going to become really the modality of the future, because what we have now, I hear from many parents and have experienced for myself, isn't working in the way that we want. We have pharmaceutical approaches and we have behavioral approaches. And beyond that, we just ask our kids or ourselves to just get it together. And the part of the brain that we are working with is not the part of the brain that can just pull it together. We're often working with issues that are as deep in the brain as those levels of the brain that grow your toenails. So we want to be able to address the brain at the level of its own challenges, rather than try to force ourselves into behavior that looks like recovery and is not. The people that we work with are children and adults who have any form or degree of neurological impairment, from a head injury, a traumatic birth, from emotional and physical trauma. We work with children with diagnoses of autism and developmental delay, with cerebral palsy, with dyslexia, dysgraphia, attention deficit disorder, Tourette syndrome, and a wide range of other issues. Um, so as we are going through this today, I know that we have a limited time, and some of you that are here today have already some understanding about the brain and its functions. And so I might be leaving out some details you feel you really want to understand more. And that's just a matter of time. We do have that information, and I'd be glad to share it with any of you in perhaps future webinars. But what I'd like you to refer to is the chart that Jesse has sent out. And also, Jesse, can we put that chart up on the screen? That chart gives you an overview of the central nervous system and how it functionally develops. And when we are looking at the brain, what we usually look at for considering recovery is that from that green level up. Most of us consider the cortex. How can we retrain the brain at a level where we can bring it to our awareness, how we can manage it and create new habits. What I want to talk about today is not that part of our brain. I want to talk about the two areas that are most frequently overlooked. And that would be those lower three levels, because so often we have a concussion, maybe being rear-ended on the freeway. You go to your doctor, you're dizzy, you're seeing double, you're a little confused. They say rest for a couple of weeks, give the brain a chance to heal. And 6 months later, if there's still issues, we have to learn to live with them. And I don't believe that that's the path that we have to take. That does not have to be our trajectory of healing. One of the things I want to do today is go over this chart. We're really going to focus on that level called the pons, which also includes the amygdala. And we're also going to look at that midbrain, also called the midcerebrum, because these are the two most involved areas that are often overlooked. We're going to take a passing glance at that medulla and spinal cord. If you look at the chart, quickly, I want to just explain how it's laid out. The vertical bars are talking about function. So we have sensory issues on one side. We're looking at how does vision develop, auditory develop, how do tactile skills develop. On the other side, we are looking at how does the brain put things out. So how we move around, how we speak, how we use our hands. So if we are understanding how the brain takes in information and puts out information at all these levels of the central nervous system, we get a really good vision of how to impact certain behaviors, challenges, and disabilities. Now, I'm going to start and briefly take a look at that medulla and spinal cord. One of the things that arises from those deepest levels of the brain are a lot of primitive reflexes. And people ask me about reflexes all the time. And yes, we do deal with reflexes. And in fact, some of the people who were the primary investigators into how the brain develops began to research reflexes in the 1940s. And I have a fabulous book about reflexes that was printed in 1954. And it just does wonderful overview of some deep exploration of reflexes. If you are injured, however, at that level of the brain, you are profoundly injured, likely profoundly disabled. And it's a very hard brain to recover. Most people who die at the scene of an accident have some injury to the medulla or spinal cord. I'm working with one young man who was struck by lightning, and he is the only client I'm working with right now who has a medulla spinal cord injury and is paralyzed, blind, and functionally mute. So we're not going to get into that a lot today, although that's a discussion we could have in the future. What I want to focus on now is, if we look at the chart again, I want to go up to that pons level brain, which also includes the amygdala. Both of those brains start coming on board at about 1 to 3 months. And what do I mean by that? Well, our brain is all in there when we're born. We have the whole brain in this body, most of it being unavailable. And it's going to become available by a process called myelinization. Myelin is a fatty insulating material that grows up and surrounds areas of the brain to make them available. And as it grows up through the brain, we get access to these different layers. So as myelin grows up from the medulla and spinal cord into the pons and amygdala, we get specific skills. And we're going to go across from left to right at that brain that says pons. And we're going to take a look at the functions that show up in all those categories. So what's going to happen for a typically developing infant at that level of the brain is that they're going to start developing horizontal eye tracking. The purpose of the activity is to keep track of a caregiver, and their eyes will start tracking back and forth in the horizontal plane, which is going to be really useful for reading, as you can imagine. Babies at that stage can develop, they have a perception of outline. They like best to look at the human face. And in fact, their only focal distance is from the nursing mother's eyes to their eyes. So they also begin to make comfortable eye contact, which begins to trigger some of their mirror neurons and thus prompting oxytocin release. So that's what's happening visually. Auditorily, we get the babies that startle at any loud sound. That's an important feature to notice in an infant, because one of the earliest signs that I have seen of that tells us we're potentially looking at a child in the autism spectrum is a lack of startle to loud or to explosive and sudden noises. So we want to know that the baby can startle, and later on as the brain matures, that startle is suppressed a bit more. Another function, if we go over one more box on that pons level brain, is under the category called perception of vital sensation. Excuse me, I'm living in the smoke here, and I hope you will understand. I have a little smoke cough. So at this stage of the brain, it's not that children cannot feel strong sensation prior to this, but by the time they get to this 1 to 3 months approximately age frame, 1 to 7, sometimes 1 to 7 months, within that framework, they begin to get a more discriminating sense of heat and cold and pain and hunger. And I'll tell you as an aside that whenever I work with someone with anorexia, they always have some issue at that level of the central nervous system. But the sensation I want to focus on tonight is pain, because pain has a very particular function. Pain almost links us to the rest of the world. If I feel pain, that gives me the understanding that when I see someone else in pain, they are having an experience that's uncomfortable. When I cannot feel pain and I see someone next to me with their face all screwed up and water coming out of their eyes, it actually kind of looks funny, because I can't understand that pain exists. I work with so many children who do not feel pain appropriately. It's muted. And what that begins to look like is it starts looking like bullying. It starts looking like picking on other kids, hitting other kids. It sounds like biting and kicking. It looks like biting and kicking parents, or if the abuse isn't taken out on the parents, it can start looking like slamming one's body into the wall. And this is on a continuum. I've rarely worked with a child who seemed completely oblivious to pain, although I did work with a young man who broke his leg on a soccer field and continued playing the game on the broken bone because he did not want to stop for the pain that he didn't feel. But if each of you reflects on the words sympathy, empathy, compassion, each of those words has in some way the implication that I know how I feel, so I know how you feel. And lack of understanding of pain at a neurological level can lead to the lack of understanding of physical and emotional needs of others. I had the opportunity, and it was an opportunity, to work with the forensic patients in the state of California at Napa State Hospital in the forensic unit. This is the criminally insane. And every single one of 12 men I evaluated had an exceptionally high pain threshold and a separation from the primary caregiver in the first year of life. So those are the sensory functions at this pons level brain. They are functions that alert the baby to life-threatening situations to which the baby is going to respond. And we'll talk about their response in a minute. But if you jump over now and take a look at the mobility category, what you're going to see is the word crawling in the prone position. And crawling, in our definition and many others, it may not be yours, but we call crawling what you do on your belly, with your belly on the floor. That has such an important role in our development that we have fully overlooked. One of the amazing things that it does is our species is unique in that we fully rely on our lower body for support, the sense of standing one's ground, standing up for oneself, for mobility, for grounded strength. And when we get that, that frees our upper body for carving and shaping our world, for making relationships, for pulling things in, people in, for pushing them away, to create our environment. So when we are crawling, we are establishing this, because the crawl looks like a strong thrust from the lower body that moves through the upper body, and the upper body guides the baby forward. And even in the crawling, as it is matured, and crawling goes from immature and unfinished to mature and finished, you can see the lower body learning its role in the support of this human being. So if you know children who can't stand up for themselves, if you have a friend who can't stand their ground, if you yourself feel ungrounded, it's interesting to go back to the crawling and see what you see. So when we get babies that are crawling on their bellies during this time period, we get integrated hip sockets, because force vectors through the bones of the leg into the hip socket start shaping a hip socket around the head of the femur. We start stimulating the pelvic area of these children. And so we start getting some awareness that by the time they're about 3 years old makes them much easier to toilet train. The little feet start pushing off the floor. And what we get from that is a reinforcement of the arches in the feet. Many of the children I work with are flat-footed. And it also prompts the rest of these activities, these functions at this level of the brain, to have all the appropriate responses to its sensory environment. We teach the brain, we prompt the brain to track the eyes in the vertical. We prompt the brain to learn that a loud sound is startling. We support the brain in developing a more appropriate response to heat, cold, pain, and hunger. When we're crawling on our tummies, we start reinforcing what they call the lordotic curves of the spine, so the neck and the lower back. And we tone all of the muscles of the body. Crawling is it's a full body activity. So many of our children have missed their crawling. And as a result, we have children who are unable to do many of these functions that we're talking about. And often when I work with children from orphanages, they have missed this activity altogether. There are some orphanages that tie the babies into the beds face up with a little rope across their chest for the first year of life, or until somebody comes and adopts them. There are orphanages that have a little chain around the baby's ankle and chain them to the floor so that they cannot move forward. So orphanages are no place to develop a healthy brain. And crawling supports the development of that healthy brain. When people say, oh, but my baby hated tummy time, I think one of the things that we are overlooking is that babies should probably be put down on their tummies as soon as a few weeks old, get used to it, and get that opportunity to experience what pushing and thrusting does, not only for the body, but for the brain. This is brain growth, if you will. Um, at that stage, as we move over to past the mobility into the language development, what is happening for the baby at this stage is that they have a very loud cry that says, help, come get me, something's going to kill me. And this is a black and white thinking brain. And everything is either a threat or it's a comfort. And so if they are too hot, they're going to very loudly. If they're hungry, they're wah, wah, wah. If they're too hot, too cold, in pain, or hungry, they're going to cry loudly, and that cry is meant to draw us in towards them. And my teacher, Florence Scott, used to say, no sane adult within earshot of that crying baby can ignore them. However, I know that I have worked with a number of families where the parent at that time was not particularly what you'd call sane or present or available, or they were in an institutional setting. And what starts to happen is that baby stops asking for its needs to be met. Now, we need to meet these babies' needs. There's no way you can spoil this baby. This baby is crying out saying, I need, I feel like I'm going to die because I'm hungry. And we come and feed the baby, and the baby has a sense of empowerment. Like, I know how to ask for my needs. In the only way I have, I'm asking for my needs to be met. And this very friendly universe is coming back and meeting my needs. So the baby feels empowered as a full, valid human being through that call response cycle. The absence of that cry in any child, if that never happens, it should be a little bit of an alarm bell. Now, when we move over to hand function, there's an interesting transition that's happening. The baby is born with their thumb and their fist, and as they move through this phase, coming up to about 6-7 months, whenever you put your finger in the baby's hand, they may hold on, much as they did soon after they were born. But if you put much pressure, the hand will open up, the fingers will open. And that opening is also that releasing of the hand is what you see in a neurotypical baby. But there are two situations where you don't see it. One is if there's a specific injury to the brain, and you see it with people who have strokes or head injuries, where the hand gets locked in that position. There's another neurological soft sign that we look at, and this was brought to our attention by Florence Scott, my teacher, when we first started looking at a disorder that was highlighted by the adoption of many Romanian orphans in the 1980s. And at that time, reactive attachment disorder, which is a disorder of bonding, was not known in the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual. It wasn't in there. And she said, we have to do something for these children. We have to figure out what's going on, because they're going to come in and ruin these families. And I was an early student that totally went by me, why they would ruin the families. And any of you who have dealt with reactive attachment disorder have no misunderstandings about that. They can be very difficult. Nonetheless, one of the neurological soft signs that she saw was that these children, whenever she put them on their tummy, if they were 3 years old or 7 years old or 12 years old, they would put their hands right back into that fetal grasp with the thumb and the fist. That is something that I see even in adults, and even with very sophisticated adults who are about to go into a stressful situation, thumbs in fists. It is such an indicator of stress that I've really begun to count on it to know whether or not what we're doing is stressing out the child. So these are some of the sensory and motor functions, or the input and output functions of this pons level brain. And so our impaired child at that level, and by impaired I mean they may have They may have been adopted. They may have lived their life in an orphanage and had no opportunity to move. They may have had an impairment at birth. You may be an adult who got hit by a car and have injury to that level of the brain. You can have a stroke and have injury to that level of the brain. But some of the challenges that can come up here are poor visual tracking. Some of our kids are still bedwetters. There can be challenges with bonding or being able to feel close to anyone following that kind of injury. Um, they can have overwhelming anxiety, even if they're in a safe environment. And their clumsiness, they have a kind of clumsiness that arises from the fact that crawling, in the brilliant design that it is, starts separating out the proximal joints from the torso. So that means that the shoulders get range of motion and the hips get range of motion. But if we haven't done any crawling, you might see this child walking like a little, like they've got a snowsuit on with no articulation at these, what we're calling proximal joints. Another thing that I often see with these kids is that they're flat-footed and they may toe in as a result of some trauma to the central nervous system or delay. So this is what these lowest level injuries look like. I want to move up to that next level. It's called the midbrain or mid-cerebrum. And the reason I'm giving you both names is that I'm well aware that there's a tiny, tiny piece of our brain that is called the midbrain. But those boxes that are outlined in yellow there. And what we see there under that category that's visual is the ability of the let me back up a minute. I want to make a general statement about sensory issues at that level, because these are the kids that have sensory processing disorder, and specifically they are very sensory avoidant. So what is happening there, and how does it relate to this model? Well, the thalamus is a part of this brain area that sends information to the cortex, the things that we need to pay attention to. So everything, hopefully while you're sitting here, most of your attention is on our discussion. If you have a sick child in the house, or if you have kids running through, or if you're cooking dinner while you're doing this, there is a part of your attention that's going to be diverted elsewhere. The thalamus, though, can keep really good track of what you need to pay attention to. So you should probably not be paying attention to the air system in your house, or some clicking in a dryer nearby, or a car that goes by outside. The children and adults that have an immature or a damaged thalamus are going to be sending everything to that cortex. So they are attending to everything all the time. The sound of the air system might be as important as someone speaking to them. They can't prioritize. Prioritization is impossible with an immature or damaged thalamus. Lights may be too bright. Sounds may be too loud. Multiple streams of auditory information might be overwhelming. These are kids that don't want to go to play dates and adults who hang out in the corner of the room at parties, who hate the stimulus of all that activity. Tactily, we can be overwhelmed by touch. We can be overwhelmed by the feel of a collar or a necklace. We can feel overwhelmed by zippers and snaps, or the number of children I know who can't wear jeans is just enormous. And many of them finally, it's sort of a bragging point on parents' parts when they are able to wear jeans. So these are our sensory avoidant children. And what this is, it's sort of sensory integration 101. It's an immaturity in a place in the brain, and that does not have to be a lifetime sentence. So in addition to giving us the ability to cope with our sensory environment, I want to go back to the individual boxes that we were looking at. So visually, there's another, aside from processing all of the sensory input, one of the things that our eyes does at this point is we develop as the nerves that go to the muscles that pull the eyes into alignment so that we have two eyes looking at the same thing at the same time, giving us three-dimensional vision. That is developing between about 7 and 12 to 14 months. It develops as a result of the movement activities we are doing. So what that looks like if it is impaired is it may look like seeing double, having words moving on the page, reading being exhausting. I have adults who've had head injuries who've complained that it's harder to read, it's harder to focus. I have children who are reluctant readers, even though they have the intelligence to read, the eyes are not tracking together. This is not a glasses issue. It's a brain issue. And when the eyes begin to converge, many of the children and adults I work with go from being reluctant readers to avid readers and avid skilled readers. It can be very exciting. Our children, I'm gonna make sure that we leave some time for questions here. So the children at this stage auditorily hear tone of voice. So you can say anything that you want to this baby and say very, very sweetly, let's see, what does mommy need to get at the grocery store today? I think we need some bread. And they don't care what you're saying to them. If it's in a sweet, loving tone of voice, they're going to babble and coo back at you. And their babbling and cooing is very important, by the way. If you have an angry voice, they're going to be upset even if you say, we have to go to the grocery store today and we've got to get bread. And this tone of voice, same words, will upset them. So they're very sensitive to that, and they will babble and coo and even create their own sentences and paragraphs and thoughts and emotions and stories with a lot of tonality, but with no words involved. So that child that speaks in a flat tone of voice, we're jumping over now to the sort of auditory and language sort of blend here a little bit. But they will begin to develop their babbling and cooing. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. But in the child who is older and has that function is not mature or has been disabled in some way, they can't figure out where to insert themselves into a conversation. They're very awkward at, two parents may be talking and the child walks in right in the middle. It's like, Mom, where's my lunchbox? Didn't you hear we were talking? Well, no, they didn't actually. I mean, can't you wait till we pause? No, they can't. They can't find all the little stops and hesitations and bullet points and themes that are running through the conversation because they cannot hear the tonality. Sometimes they're just terrible at getting jokes, and they can be teased and bullied really badly because they don't understand that they're being teased because they don't understand the tonality of the kids around them. Now, tactily, if you move over another box there, and we're at that mid-cerebrum, mid-brain level, and it says tactile. There are many important things kicking in here, and I know that I'm doing this, it's a brief overview, but I want to tell you about two. One is that the child begins to learn where their body is in space. They're quite clear to the quarter inch of where they are in their body at a very early age. And this, when it's not as mature as the child that's running into walls and tripping over the furniture and dropping things off the side of the table because they can't see where the edge is, they don't know where their bubble is. Okay, for those of you who've tried to teach a child their bubble because they're always in somebody else's bubble, it's not really something you can teach. You can tell them that until they're about 17 years old, and they're still not getting it because they don't know where their body is in space. But the minute that they know where their body is in space, they know where their bubble is. So that is an example of trying to deal with it behaviorally, like stay in your bubble. Where's your bubble? Jeremy, will you show me where your bubble is again? And stay, that's your bubble, stay in that bubble and 5 minutes later, Jeremy is pulling on Sammy's hair outside of his bubble and in her bubble because he doesn't know where he is. And sometimes kids do need to just touch other kids and adults just to know where they are. The other function that comes up though here is that you, many of you have heard about midline. They can't cross the midline. And there are a lot of artificial approaches to try to create this. But nature has a plan for this. The corpus callosum is the bridge between our two cortical hemispheres, and it is the only connection between the two brains. If you took a model of the brain and took away the corpus callosum, the brain would fall apart. And initially, that's what scientists thought the callosum was for, was to just keep the two brains from falling into the skull. We now know it is a critical structure. It takes information from the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere and the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere. And babies in that first year of life integrate the functioning of that corpus callosum so that they can, later on in their life, they can read words on a page, but also take those words over to the side of the brain that creates the story that those words are trying to illustrate. These are the children that can have strong impulses, but also can take information over to the left side of the brain where those impulses can be controlled. This is a child that can understand three-part direction, but also remember them long enough to do them. If you have a child that you say, okay, what did I just tell you? Go upstairs, get your boots and your coat. And they go upstairs and get lost on the stairwell. So having a functioning corpus callosum is really maximizes our intelligence. For those of you who have children that are high fluency, low comprehension, this is the corpus callosum. For those of you that can't, for those of you who yourselves or your children cannot remember what you went into the room for, this may be the corpus callosum. For those of you that can't integrate right and left, who doesn't know where right and left is, for those of you children or adults who can't tell the difference between a B and a D without great effort, this is the corpus callosum. It has so many functions in the brain. We really do have two completely different brains, and without a highly functioning corpus callosum, we get in a lot of trouble. So another example I was thinking of is that if you have a highly functioning corpus callosum, you can be deeply engaged in an activity like Legos or balancing your checkbook, for those of you that do it that way. But also you can be redirected. Hey, it's dinner time, and shift gears. For so many of our kids, they simply can't do that. So when you take a look at labels like dyslexia, ADD, impulse control issues, memory problems, as well as crossing the midline, all of these result from that immaturity at the corpus callosum. I took notes not because I don't know what I'm saying, but I got to condense it all so that we can get it into this hour. If you move over to the box that says creeping, the motor skill, this is what babies do on their hands and knees. And this activity, like the crawling at the level below, this activity stimulates the brain to integrate all of the functions at that level. And how do we know that? We know it, one, because when we see children who've been swaddled for the first year of their lives without any movement, have many of these functions have not developed. We know it because when we watch the baby do these activities, we see these functions mature. We know it because it is sort of God or Mother Nature's gift to us. This is how we grow a brain. So not only does the creeping on hands and knees mature all of these functions, and not only is it's nature's plan, but it matures the corpus callosum. It helps moderate all these hypersensitivities to visual and auditory and tactile stimuli. It supports the visual convergence that we need for reading. And to the extent that the vision therapists that know me will send clients to me to do this work before they start vision therapy. Okay, so we want to work from the brain out with these issues, not from the eyes in or the ears in or heavens forbid the medications, except when it's appropriate. Language is also over there to the right side of that chart in the middle there. And this is where the children do create those meaningful sounds. They have socially appropriate speech. They know tone of voice. They can carry a tune. They have lovely prosody in their speech. And it's also where I look at kind of their body language. How do they make appropriate facial expressions, body posture, gesture? How do they relate using their body, using their voice? How do they bridge that gap? Now we move over to the hand function, and many of you get concerned about pen grip, and I work with children who do not even have they haven't matured past what's called prehensile grasp, which is the function of the brain below the cortex. At this stage, the baby can take their whole hand and pick up something this way. And some of you may have kids that still eat this way with this prehensile grasp. So when we take a look at kids who have some of these midbrain dysfunctions, but let me go back because I want to include diagnoses too. Now, I want to say right off the bat here that we do not treat diagnoses. We treat immature functions in the brain. But children who have immature functionality at that pons level brain often have diagnoses of reactive attachment disorder. They may have oppositional defiant disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. They can be the kids who are bullying, who have poor tracking while they're reading, very reluctant readers. They may have that awkwardness that looks kind of like a snowman gait. Some of the people I work with have anorexia. Some of them lack a conscience. I have worked with people who kill, and their lack of conscience, we can actually relate back to this brain. They're black and white thinkers, very simple in their thinking. For some children, and occasionally an adult, they still wet the bed past the age of 3, and they're very sensory seeking. They want lots of impact and pow, wham, and loud, and they want it big, fast, and furious, right? They want, as adults, to jump out of an airplane with a parachute. They are the ones that I've met who ride motorcycles down curvy highways after drinking with no helmet, which is always a bad recipe. So those are the kinds of kids that I see who tend to end up with lots of symptoms at that level that we're calling the pons and the amygdala. The kids that I see who have levels at that midbrain or midcerebrum level are often labeled ADD, dyslexic, dysgraphic. They have phobias, sensory avoidance, anxiety that's not PTSD, but a kind of a general anxiety. They might have hypothalamic issues like weight set point or strange sleeping behaviors, the inability to relax. They may have a poor sense of their body in space. They may have very awkward, poor social skills, sometimes trouble carrying a tune. They have maybe sometimes a flat spoken tonality. They might have high fluency and low comprehension in reading. They may have memory issues, be impulsive. And again, we don't treat those things. These are the issues that show up when these levels of the brain are impaired. So our only job is to help with these levels of the brain and help them mature. And sometimes we do find things that don't yield to the work, possibly because they have a gut health issue or other issues. But the majority, when we see it as an issue and when the neurological soft sign is resolved, we see changes in behavior. So those are the 2 levels that I feel are left out the most when we're looking at head injuries and recovery and heaven's sakes, looking at learning disabilities. I don't think anyone looking at things like this and ADHD. Um, the key to helping all of these functions mature is if we go back and replicate the developmental sequence. And what we want to do is replicate the activities that the child did at that level of the brain where we see missing functions. And in order to be effective, the work has to be done daily. This is when you talk about the actual work that we do, we provide a program that's done daily. And it has to be done with frequency and intensity and duration. And what we work with those reflexes. And how the reflexes usher in whole body movement patterns and how those lead into motor activities that then shift the whole sensory system. So that we're working with reflexes, movement sensation, reflexes, movement sensation in an upward spiral. So I would not advise just integrating a reflex because you have to have the rest of it, or just working to calm down a sensory response because you have to work with reflexes, movement sensation, reflexes, movement sensation, and these upward spirals. Now, I get so excited about what I'm talking about, but I've been pretty efficient tonight. So I want to just take a little minute to tell you what the appointments look like too, because if you're interested, I do have 30-minute free screenings for five people. We'll, take that information later. But initially, our initial assessment is 3 hours. What we do is we go through that whole chart, not just the things I was talking about here. We go through the whole chart and look at everything at every level and look for any gaps in that developmental process. Wherever there are gaps, we are going to be designing a program to mature those functions. And this can happen at any point in the lifespan. The 3-hour appointment for a child looks like sitting down for maybe 45 minutes, talking to the parents about the history and the issues. And then we get to spend a good 20 minutes playing with the child, if we're talking about a child. And then we get to go back to the parent, and the parent will stay with the child. Then we let the child leave and go play. While we talk about what is going on and why is this child biting, or why is this child who is 8 years old still scribbling like this all over the paper? Why is this child unable to make eye contact, comfortable eye contact? And then what we do is assign the activities that will help fill in those gaps. And it's done every day. It's not the easiest program I've ever seen. In fact, I think it's probably one of the harder programs I've run into. But what I know is it makes a difference. I had a wonderful email from a mom who is a speech therapist and whose child was really not speaking, missing lots and lots of sounds. This is on my website. On my Facebook page. And lots of abusive behaviors, and had been in ABA therapy. And then COVID hit, and this child now has done nothing but this program. And they went back to ABA, and they had to rewrite all of his goals because he'd surpassed all the goals. And the mom, who is a speech therapist herself and has been working for years with her child, saw all kinds of changes in speech, such that they also had to change all of his speech goals when they reassessed him after a few months of doing this work. So by working with the brain, we're working with the most efficient system. We're working with the master program for how our brain integrates itself. And it's all natural, and it's all non-pharmaceutical. So then after about 2 to 3 months, we get back to everybody. We get back and we do a reassessment that takes 2 hours instead of 3, and we look at what has changed. And what can be so exciting for me is that first reassessment, when families I've had families share. One family shared 36 different things that were new and good. It's always the first question that I ask at a reassessment, but what's new and good? It's the best job I have ever had, because I get the pleasure of seeing your kids and yourself get better. It is um, it is hard work. It is so well worth it. It is so well worth it. The average child spends 2 to 3 years doing this work, and I have worked with families who have spent 2 to 3 years just adjusting their child's medication. In 2 to 3 years, you track those two children. The one that has been working with this material has graduated. The child that's been adjusting medication may still have the same issues, but are medicated to appropriate behaviors. So I just love talking about this stuff, but I want to be able to give you guys a chance to ask questions, and we have 10 minutes for questions. Jesse's going to say a little thing right before we start asking questions, though.
Yes, over in the chat box, you can add your questions here. I know we have a call-in listener, and I've connected with that person via email, so they can feel free to email me any questions as well. And if anyone is interested in one of the free 30-minute screenings, you can just put, just write in free screening in the chat, and I'll kind of gather those as they come in. Another question I had for you, Betty, is how long is a program that a child or adult might be doing at home each day? You said, it's important to be doing it daily. How long would
Thank you.
that
That's
be?
a great question. For one thing, well, by the time we put it all together, a child might be doing 45 minutes to an hour a day. Not necessarily a solid hour. I have some families who are doing 10 minutes in the morning before school. Homeschool people, which is just about everybody right now, they're doing it as a break from schooling. So they might do a 10-minute session and a 15-minute session and a 10-minute session and a little bit before they go to bed. I've had people do it all at once because they say, well, we're doing it, we're going to get it over with. Anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour. Now, I work with many kids who have so low tolerance for any directed activity, such a low tolerance for a low physical tolerance, that they simply cannot move that much without exhaustion. And we start very small with those children. When we work with someone with a brain injury that is very fragile, we start small. We start with the most simple things. But I want to share with you that when we are working and I see families who are very similar, and one has done the work every day and the other family has worked really, really, really hard 3 or 4 days a week, we just don't get the results with the 3 or 4 days a week. And that's what makes it rather intense.
Another question is, if we do a program, are there a lot of materials or extra things that I'm going to need to have around my house or anything like that to do this kind of work?
Great question. Thank you. Some children are very sensitive to crawling around on the floor. And definitely adults can be very unhappy about being in that environment. So sometimes we'll suggest that they get mats to track along the floor. Adults often need knee pads. If we want to add tools for some of the sensory work that we do, we usually can find things around the house or find low-cost items. I've had people do very elaborate things, like put in trampolines and swings hanging from the beams in the basement, and I've had people do it with almost no equipment at all, or none. So that's the answer.
Another question, you talk about families doing it, and what about an adult doing it? Is that something where an adult could do it independently, or would there have to be another person there with the adult to get the program finished?
Thank you. Very good question. Adults do this for themselves all the time. And I've seen many adults. Now, I want to acknowledge to all of you that about 85 to 90% of my clients are children. And the advantage of working with children is that they have parents who say, you're going to do this, we're going to do this now. And they just keep working with them to get it done. Adults often will say, I will do anything to get better. And in 2 weeks, they're bored and stop, which is always very sad. But when I have worked with adults, and if you are an adult who is interested in it for yourself or another adult, I have a couple of testimonials I'd love to send to you from adults who've had enormous success when they did the program with frequency, intensity, and duration on a daily basis. I've had people recover from significant head injuries who are adults, and they can do it all by themselves. And I've even sadly had one woman who did her full recovery. She didn't want her husband to know, and she did it while he was at work, and he never knew. Which was sad for me, but she got, and because the only support she had was from me, but I've even had that. Yes, you can do it on your own.
Another question from Anita is, once you see benefits, do the benefits stick or have you seen regressions? Is there a maintenance program?
Excellent question. When a baby is integrating their brain, they need to work really, really hard during that period they're making the connections. But then as they are starting to use these new functions, life itself keeps the brain connected. Now, many of you may have worked for great health, and you find you've maybe gone on a cleanse and a good diet, and you find your health is stable and excellent, wonderful. And then life throws you a curveball, and suddenly your health is not so good, and you have to kind of rebuild it a little bit. And in that same way, people can have traumas and stresses that might compromise the work we've done. But yes, in circumstances where there's no further trauma or abuse, the changes do hold, because just living your life holds those changes in the same way it would for an infant growing into a child, growing into a teenager, growing into an adult. Yeah.
And also, can the program be done with a child who is highly kinesthetic and cannot follow directions? How would that look?
Oh, yes. And we work towards more and more cooperation, but not in ways that are in any sense punitive. We work with a child where they are at. So many of the children I work with who are highly kinesthetic and don't follow directions. And, even in the assessment, what children can and will do gives me information, but I'm sitting and talking to them, and what they can't and won't do also tells me a lot about them. So, and the history and the profile generally give me a lot of sense as well. Other questions? We are just rocking this, aren't we, Jessie?
Is there an age where it's best to start? Like, could a 2-year-old start? Is it best to start
The
older?
youngest
Can you
child that
start
I
as a
worked with was
teenager?
6 weeks old. She was born with she had a challenge in the birth process that was floppy, and we started at 6 weeks. Of course, they can't follow instructions, but we take them through the developmental sequence. And that child, fortunately, by the time she hit 3 years old, was no different than other 3-year-olds. The hardest group to work with, and I bet you never saw this one coming, is teenagers. And not because teenagers cannot grow. They can grow and change as fast as anyone else, and I have seen it many times. But they have a will of their own, and we want to work with that. And sometimes we have to be strong for them where they cannot be strong for themselves. So finding that balance where you're both respecting them, but asking something of them that might be very hard, it's a delicate dance. Everybody else can do it too. All those kiddos in between do really, really well.
Now we have a kind of a lull in our webinar chat. So if you have any additional questions, please feel free to send them out. I also want to point out that next Tuesday at the same time, we'll be having another webinar going a little bit deeper on trauma and anxiety. And then the week after that, which I believe is the 29th, we'll be talking about learning concerns and behavior issues. I do have another question here. Does it help with cerebellar hypoplasia?
Yes. And I would love that person to contact me directly so that we can have a good conversation about it. What we want to do is optimize brain functioning. I have worked with children with minimal corpus callosum. I've worked with children with Down syndrome, and those are things that the facts of Down syndrome or a small corpus callosum cannot be changed, but the maximizing function can be changed. We can maximize function in all of those children. I've worked with some children who've done extraordinarily well on children with the diagnosis of Down syndrome.
And then, is there anything that has worked well with teens in this program? I'm not sure if
Their currency, what is their interest, either in themselves, like I want to be able to drive a car. Sorry, this is my smoke cough. I see a few more people here who are under smoke at the same time. And to those of you in California, your smoke blew out to the ocean and it blew back on Seattle. What were you thinking? I had one young man who wanted to drive a car, and his parents said, your eyes don't work together. You can't drive a car. You're going to run into other vehicles. And we worked on, and he had a temper. So not being able to see where other cars are and having a bad temper is not a good formula for a good driver. They said, we're not going to let you drive. You're not getting a driver's license or a car. Nothing until you do this. And he actually wanted to work for that, and he did. And he got his car and his driver's license because he got his vision and his organized and his temper under control. Now, for some children, they don't have an end goal for the work itself, but they might want a reward or a payment. I mean, we go to work and we get paid. If we're asking our children to work hard and they may not fully understand it, should we pay them? I have lots of parents who object to that, and I have lots of parents who think that's a really good idea. So, and whatever their currency is.
Now, many of the people have been asking, is there going to be a recording of this? And yes, we are recording it, and it will be emailed to the email you used to register, and it will be about 24 to 72 hours. They said some of them are taking a little bit longer to come through, so if it doesn't come exactly tomorrow, it will be coming by the end of the week.
Can I say something about that too? For the next, for the week after you get it, if you want to share it with somebody and they are interested in a 30-minute screening, yeah, invite them to at least write to us. You know, you've got my website and so on, and ask, because we may or may not have 5. I don't know, you know, and so I want to do 5 free screenings for this group. I'll offer it again next Tuesday when we're going to talk about how trauma changes the brain and how the traumatized brain creates more trauma. We're going to talk about that loop. And I hope that those of you who are here will come back for that, and then again, and invite anybody else who might be interested. We're not going to go through the whole chart again, but we are going to look at that.
We have 2 more questions. What are some ideas to mitigate the behavioral issues that come out when going through the program and consistently challenging the nervous system? For instance, if it's difficult to get them out of an elevated state.
Okay, that is a question that's particular to a client, and what I would really like to do is talk to that person. And here's one of the things I'm not trying to be obscure. What I want to say is every brain is a universe unto itself. Every child's experience of their brain is unique. Some children will take strong direction and others need to be urged, and we want to work with their will. This is not about destroying their will. It's about amplifying who they are. But because every child is so unique, we want to have those particular issues like on a client to practitioner basis, and I'd be happy to talk about that to anybody, if whether you're my client or not.
And we had one more that was along the same lines, motivating a client who was diagnosed with autism at around 19.
Yeah.
So that would probably.
Sometimes I spend an hour talking to parents about motivation. There's another piece, and it's the less happy piece, but not every single child will be able to do this. And I wish every child could do this. And one of the things that I want to see happen is that the awareness of this work is more and more available so that it can be used in more schools. It is used in some schools very effectively. So when you get a community of children, and there's a marvelous community in Minnesota. Well, I don't know if Chance to Grow is doing it fully anymore. They used to. and you walk into the school and there are children crawling down the hallway. And nobody thinks twice about it. And it is the norm. And when you normalize the work for teenagers, it makes them more and more willing to participate. So my hope is that by distributing information about how we can avoid a world of drugs and behavior programs, how we avoid that, my hope is that we can we can normalize these things so that it becomes more the standard to do this kind of approach rather than what has been available to date. Our kids are suffering, our kids are hurting. We also fold into our work supports for parenting. I'm not a parent consultant, but I have a team of the most amazing people in the country that support our families and support them with love and compassion and knowledge and expertise. So this is, I also feel like I'm a gateway to lots of those services. I provide a very specific function, though. My only job in the world is to normalize brain function. But I will tell you that I do definitely have children who no longer have the diagnosis of ADHD, who no longer have the diagnosis of autism, who no longer have the diagnosis of Tourette's syndrome. And is this every child? No, it's not every child, but we maximize the development for every child that we work with. So
it looks like we will be tying things up, but I want to welcome everyone to join us next week for the trauma and anxiety webinar, and also going deeper into learning issues and concerns, which will be on September 29th. You can register for those on Eventbrite, and also please share that information with those you work with, those you know, and those who might need this information for themselves and their family.
And, you know, Jessie, and this is the first time Jessie and I have done this together. And I just want to thank Jessie so much. And I bet you that that was the closing line for the whole event. But I'm going to add, please do share the video of this, because I know that there are families out there that are struggling. There are families on my block who are struggling. There are 25 families whose homes I could walk to this evening they're struggling. Our children are hurting, and we need to figure out how to do something better about it. So share this as broadly as you can, if you would, and I invite many more people to come back for the trauma discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty.
Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.